pie. So I have my chicken breasts over on the stove boiling. We're going to go ahead and mix up our pie crust. I use this pie crust recipe for all of my pies. This one is going to be a savory crust though, so we're not going to add any sugar to this. If you would be making a sweet pie like an apple pie or a cherry pie, you would add some sugar, but we'll go ahead and get into it. You're going to start with 2 cups of regular all-purpose flour. And I'm doing mine in a food processor. You can do this by hand. If you do it by hand though, to mix it, you're going to need a pastry blender, which is this thing right here, because you don't want to touch your pie crust with your hands and get your butter warmed up. The colder the butter that goes into your pie crust, the flakier the crust will be. So then I have my butter. This actually just came right out of the freezer, and that actually will be a little bit better. Refrigerated is fine, but to make sure it stays super cold throughout the whole process, you can go ahead and put your butter in the freezer for about maybe 10 or 15 minutes before you start. I'm just cutting it into chunks. So 1 stick, and then we're going to do another half of a stick. All right. Now, if you were making a sweet pie, you would put in about a tablespoon of sugar to this. We're not going to make a sweet one. We're going to do a savory one. So I'm going to do just a pinch of salt, like maybe half a teaspoon if it's that much. And then, since I'm using garlic powder in my recipe, I'm going to put just a little bit of garlic powder into my pie crust too. So I'm only going to do about maybe a quarter of a teaspoon of garlic powder in there. I'm going to put the lid on my food processor, and I'm going to start this on low. And this might get kind of loud, so in case you can't hear me over this food processor, what I'm doing in the next step is you want ice water, because you want to keep that butter nice and cold, so make sure it's ice water. And once this has run and I've got like a fine ground look to this, I'm going to be adding 1 tablespoon at a time, that ice water. And you're going to use about 4 to 5 tablespoons until this comes together as a dough. Alright, so there is what your dough should look like. This actually ended up taking more like 7 tablespoons instead of the 4 or 5. We're going to go ahead and make this into our crust. I have a little silicone mat that has circles that tells me how big of a crust I have. That's not necessary. If you don't have one, you can still do this at home just fine and eyeball it. So I'm just going to turn this out. And then we want to squish it together into one solid ball, but you don't want to work your pie crust too much with your hands because you don't want to warm that butter up. Alright, and that's pretty good. Now I need to make 2 crusts, one for the bottom and then one to go over top of our pot pie. So I'm just going to cut this in half, like that. Try to form it into a ball, that way it comes out round. And then I've got my pie plate over here. I always put a little bit of cooking spray in the bottom of mine to keep my crust from sticking. And then just a little bit of flour for the rolling pin. And onto the mat. Or onto your counter if you don't have a mat. And the way to keep your crust round is to roll in all directions. So if you were going to cut slices of a pizza, every direction that you would cut to make a slice, you want to roll in that direction. Alright, so I made a 12-inch crust. It's as round as it's going to be. So an easy way to transfer it to your plate is to roll your crust around your rolling pin like this. You can just pick it right up, get your plate, and then you just unroll it right into there. Okay, so for our filling, I have 2 chicken breasts that I boiled and shredded. You can use canned chicken breast if that's what you want. You can get a rotisserie chicken and shred it. You like any part of the chicken, whatever you want. I just use 2 breasts. So we're going to put these on medium heat. I'm going to add 2 cans of cream of mushroom soup and 1 can of milk. And then I'm just going to use a can of mixed vegetables, or you could use like a bag of frozen mixed vegetables, whatever you want. And then we're going to season it. And while this is going, whoa, dropping things. I've also got my oven preheating to 350 because that's what we're going to bake this pot pie at. And then for seasoning, I just do salt and pepper to taste. So however much your family likes of salt and pepper, put that much in. There's no exact measurement. If I was going to put a measurement on it, I would say maybe 1/4 teaspoon of black pepper, and then I probably do 1/2 teaspoon of salt. Garlic powder, because I put garlic in pretty much everything. We love garlic. That was probably 1/2 teaspoon to 1 teaspoon. I like to eyeball measure in case you haven't noticed. And then I'm going to throw in just a tiny little bit of basil into mine. So just a little pinch, maybe a little bit more. So if I was measuring maybe 1/8 teaspoon, it probably was less than that. And we're just going to stir this and wait until this gets good and hot all the way through. And then we're going to put this into our pie crust. And then we're going to bake our pot pie until the crusts are done, like golden brown on top. Alright, so my pie went for about 45 minutes. And it is good and done. It's nice and hard on the top. You can see some of my filling started to come out. I had a little crack in my crust. Now, if you want yours to get more brown than this on top, and this goes for a sweet pie or one of these pies, you can brush it with a little bit of milk on the top before you put it in the oven, or even like a light egg wash, and yours will get more brown on top. But this is cooked all the way through. Another thing, if you make a sweet pie like for dessert, after brushing that milk, sprinkle a little bit of granulated sugar on top, and it'll make a nice little sparkly finish on top. But this is done. The bottom is nice and brown. That's another way to check. If you check the very bottom crust, as long as it is nice and brown in the color it should be, you are good to go. So now we are ready to eat. But that is an easy recipe for chicken pot pie.